what was some of your memories of, encounters with crossing borders into different countries, different control towers, stuff like that?
Well, one fun thing I can remember is when you got to know the guys over the years. As we flew out east, it was a French country, so you used the French language for your control tower talking if you spoke French, but English is the international control tower language, so we always used English. Some of the controllers couldn't use English or French, so I would use the local language. And I would greet them in the Hausa language, and you'd say good morning to them, which is Inakwana, how did you sleep? And they'd answer you, and they'd be real friendly. And then once they were trying to translate the aviation language into Hausa, it would become quite interesting. You'd be flying in with some missionaries and working, moving them around for their work, but you're also relating to the nationals and being friendly with them. And they would, one of the natural positions that you reported was downwind. In other words, you're flying downwind and you would make a turn and turn into the wind to land. And the way they would translate that, they would say for me to, in their language, report Bayan Iska, and they would say, report behind the wind. Well, actually, you're in front of the wind. Well, your wind's kind of behind you, blowing you along, but some of those little things would be interesting. You asked about flying into Dahomey. We didn't do it too much in the early years, a lot more later on. When it was called Dahomey, it was a little stricter, getting clearances. But I remember one of the early flights down there, I took off from Niamey and I called in on the HF radio, which is for long distance, and this controller way over in East Niger calls me up in Hausa and asks me how I'm doing, and Akwana, how'd you sleep? How's your work? How's your family? And it just opens up a lot in your relationships there in Niger and Nigeria were so important. My mom and dad lived in Nigeria, in Kano, and so I would often, sometimes 2 or 3 times a month, fly from Niger, and I had to go through Kano immigration. Well, I would bring my laundry down for my mom to do because I was single, and I had this bag that was about the size of a pillowcase. And mom had made it, and it was like kind of real bright orange colors and stuff. And about the second or third time they asked me what was in there, and once they knew, they just joked and said, "Oh, here comes Jim and his dirty laundry for his mom." Another time I called into this international airport. There's BOAC, well, back in the time, BOAC and Sabina and KLM were all flying in there. And I call in and I asked the controller, could you call this number and advise them of my ETA, my expected time of arrival, because my dad would meet me at the airport. And so he did it, and he calls me back, and my call sign was Alpha Hotel Romeo. And I said, go ahead. And he says, okie dokie, your mommy says your daddy will be right there. On the international airport. So there was a lot of personal give and take that went a long way. They loved that you talked their language, you were friendly with them, you gave them the respect that they did. I had a lot of friends in Niamey that called me the White African, just because the time you'd spend with them, you'd take time to talk with them and ask them how they're doing, and it was important, and that all tied in with your whole purpose of being there as a missionary. I had a controller one day, he came and he sat under the wing of the airplane for 3 hours and asked me about the gospel and all about Christ and what he did on the cross and for salvation. And providing salvation, the opportunity to accept him as the Son of God who came to die on the cross for us. We used to fly for World Vision up in Mali, up in Menaka. And at the time there was some rebel activity, and so we had set up a way of contacting each other. We didn't have cell phones back then, but when I would take off, I would get on a frequency that we both knew, and he would advise me whether it was quiet that day and safe to come. It wasn't that far of a flight, it was about an hour and 10 minutes. On one occasion, I actually took off and he said, don't come, there's been a lot of shooting in town last night and today. one Sunday night, my wife and I are sitting, relaxing. It was 8:30, 9 o'clock, and we get a call from the control tower. And the control tower says, Jim, there's someone up in Mali and Menica with an emergency situation, and they want you to come out and talk to them, or they want to get hold of you. Interestingly enough, it's all in God's provision. The day before, I had a long flight, and I left my name and my phone number with the office where we file our flight plans, and I says, if I'm late and don't get back, again, we had no cell phones, no way of contacting except through the control tower. I'll advise the control tower to have you call my wife and say I'll be overnight. So my piece of paper with my name and my phone number is sitting there on the counter the next day, and a call comes in, not from up in Mali, but from all the way down on the coast in Lomé. Togo. It says, and they called up to Niamey and said, someone in Mali trying to get a hold of someone called Jim Rendel, there's an emergency.
Wow.
And they said, well, we've got his name and number right here, we'll call him. So they called me, I came out to the airport, and I went up to the control tower, and I talked to the control tower who had talked to Lomé, because the control tower couldn't hear the conversation, but Lomé, the way the HF radio frequencies bounce, Niamey wasn't hearing anything. So I repeated, go to our mission frequency that we used, he and I would use. And so I went up to the hangar, pulled the airplane out, and got on the other frequency. It was quite a lower band from the band we were using, and it was clear. And he says, is there any way you can come up here by this time? It was like, 9:30, 10 o'clock. My son, 3-year-old boy, fell in a 10-meter well, and he's unconscious, but he's alive. And is there any way we can get him up here? We need to get him medevaced out and get a plane from Europe to come flying down. So I said to him, well, if you have 3 cars, I can do it. So I had him park one car. I'd been there numerous times, but it was a moonless night. It was a dark night. It was blowing dust in Niamey, and it was instrument weather conditions. There was no hope of landing there if the weather was like it was in Niamey. But he said it was a little bit clearer there, but dark. I said, you'll need one car parked at the end of the runway on the east end because of the wind current. The predominant winds would be coming out of the east. So I said, park on the east end of the runway with the lights shining down the runway, and park 2 at the threshold where I'll be touching down at 45 degrees, and just give me something to aim at. And before you do it, drive up and down, make sure there's no anthills, because the ants could build these, they build 2-3 foot rock hard anthills just in a matter of weeks, and we hadn't been there for a few weeks. I took the newest airplane we had because it had a fancier autopilot with altitude hold, and I knew I'd be flying around looking down. I didn't want to, I wanted to be able to set my altitude control so I wouldn't inadvertently go too down low, get as low as I could safely. The problem was we had never been to the airport with that airplane. It had just arrived from the States. It was a used airplane, and I punched in the call sign for that airport that was in the GPS, the data system, and it took me up to nowhere. There was no lights in sight. There was nothing up there, but it was on the general heading. And so I just started circling around, making bigger circles in the dark and looking. And the second time around, about 7 or 8 miles north of this spot, I saw some lights, and I looked and I thought, well, they're set up right. It's got no one's gonna be parked out here in the middle of the desert with their lights on unless this is a runway. And I knew I was in the vicinity. Turns out that that GPS was programmed for an airport that had been used during World War II as an alternate airport. It was just a dirt strip, and it wasn't even there anymore. And this was a newer airport that we'd been using. And when we go to an airport like that, we punch in the coordinates and we save it to the GPS so we know where we're going. But I took that airplane for safety reasons, but it didn't take me to the airport. So anyway, we came around, and by the time we got up there, the visibility had gone up from like less than a mile to about 3 miles, and I could see a little bit and enough. And when I got in close, I could see the people there, and I knew I was in the right place. So we landed and came back, and by then it was like midnight. And the mother's holding the little guy, and he hasn't said anything. He's been unconscious all this time, hasn't responded to anything. But he loved airplanes, kind of like I did when I was 3 and 4 years old. And he used to come out to the airport with his dad. He'd love to come out. And when he came up, I says, "Can I touch him anywhere?" They said his back's probably okay. And I whispered in her ears, I says, "Peter, Uncle Jim's here to give you an airplane ride." And he opened his eyes, and his mom just burst into tears. So that was probably one of the most exciting flights that I've had. You know, the kids felt that you were their hero, but also the missionaries really appreciated that you were there to do medevacs and to get people where they needed to go when they were sick. And also bring the children to and from school. They would go to a boarding school, so that's kind of hard on the children, but we both went through it. The other thing that was important was when pastors and church people from this home churches would come out to visit, and they might have 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 families that are 3 different places back at the time. And the only way to get around quickly was to fly. So we'd take pastors around and visitors around so they could see the work. Then there would be mission conferences where the whole mission family would gather in one place for a conference for several days. So you'd do a lot of flying, bringing those people. There was always reasons to fly, and medevac. You always were available to do medevacs for other people, whether it was mission work or not.